Hello, this is Carrie with happyfishtarot.com. Some of you may already be aware that over on my website, I have blogged through the entire Wild Unknown Tarot. I went through the deck card by card, and I made posts talking about my interpretations of the images, and they're quite detailed. I talked about the colors, I talked about the symbolism, and I talked about my personal thoughts on what these depictions evoke within me for the meanings of the cards. It was a fairly popular series. I got a lot of emails, a lot of comments, a lot of Facebook messages from people who told me that they found that blog series useful. And so it is now up on my website for all of the world to see. Since I've now finished blogging through the entire deck, I want to continue giving some more of my thoughts and my perspectives on this deck. So I'm going to make a few videos that are going through, versus going through individual cards, I'm going to be looking at kind of groups of cards and talking about some different motifs and symbolisms that are used throughout the deck. It probably goes without saying, but I do want to mention that, of course, these are all just my thoughts and my interpretations. This is based on me spending time with the deck and me thinking about what the images evoke for me personally. So I'm by no means trying to say that you have to share my opinions, but I do want to put them out there because I think that it can provide some interesting perspectives for those of you who are trying to bond with the deck and maybe want some ideas about frames of reference for the meanings and the symbolism of the cards. With this first video in the series, I'm going to be focusing on the use of lines in the Wild Unknown Tarot. I have gone through my deck and I split the cards loosely into 4 different types of common line usage that we find in this deck. And I'm going to walk you through each of these types of line usage, and I'm going to tell you some of my thoughts on what those lines can have to offer for us in terms of how to work with these cards and how to understand their messages. I should point out as well that not all cards in the deck can be split into these categories. So this is essentially just some cards I've pulled out that do make use of lines, and there are quite a few of them in the deck, but not every card in the deck is going to fall into one of these 4 categories. First, let me just kind of walk you through each of the 4 categories, and then once I've done that, I'll go through each one a little more specifically. The first use of lines in the Wild Unknown Tarot I called the static horizontal lines, and here's an idea of what I'm talking about with that. Next up, we have the static vertical lines, and here's a few examples. And then we have center radiating lines. Here's what those look like. And our 4th category is multi-directional lines. Let's start by talking about the static horizontal lines. This is the most common line motif that we'll find in the Wild Unknown Tarot. When I went through and pulled out the cards that I found that fit into this category, there were a lot of them. This is by far the biggest segment of line usage in the Wild Unknown Tarot is the static horizontal lines. When I see these kinds of horizontal lines in the Wild Unknown Tarot, to me it seems to represent energy that is still free-flowing. So the energy is there, but it hasn't necessarily been guided into a particular direction. The Fool is one of my favorite examples of what I mean. The Fool, we think of the Fool as representing untamed, universal energy, so really an infinite energy. When we look at the Fool in the Wild Unknown Tarot and see these static horizontal lines, it does seem to kind of solidify that notion that this is energy that is still infinite. This is energy that is yet to be shaped or molded into any particular avenue. It's just kind of pure, raw, unfiltered energy. When we look at some of the other cards that have this particular line usage, we do often see that energy is neutral. So I'm not necessarily saying this energy is not doing anything, but it's energy that is more stable. It's energy that's more calm and centered. The Mother of Swords is a good example of what I mean by this, and how we can see how this use of lines kind of accentuates and ties into the card meaning. So at least I personally think of the Mother of Swords as being someone who is a fairly reasonable, centered, calm person, somebody who is clear and articulate. And so having the card lined with these stable horizontal lines is just sort of a visual cue that this deck gives to that theme. There are a few cards that get even more complex with how they make use of these static horizontal lines. The two in particular that are my favorite are the Six of Cups and the Three of Wands. So in the Six of Cups, we see at the top of the card there, we do have our static horizontal lines showing that stable energy. But below the surface, we have these roots of the tree. So we see that above, things seem to be fairly calm and fairly stable. But below the surface, there's all this complex, twisting, tangled, multifaceted energy going on. We see a similar usage in the Three of Wands. There's again the stable, the static horizontal lines going throughout the card, but then we have the center triangle with all of the colors inside, and this is actually one of my favorite cards, and the colors in the center of that triangle have this kind of mysterious, unexplored energy feeling to me. So these are just some examples of where the use of lines can be subtle and can also be quite complex. But generally speaking, this is just something you can look out for as you get to know your own Wild Unknown Tarot deck, is these static horizontal lines. And when you see those lines, just consider if the energy is infinite and if the energy is relatively undirected, or neutral would be a better way of phrasing that. One more thing I want to mention before we move on to the next category of line usage is that the colors in this deck, and particularly in this segment of cards, the static horizontal lines, we see a lot of color symbolism, and the colors give a lot of hints and a lot of evocative information about the meanings of the cards. So the use of color in this deck is something that I'm going to talk about in its own separate video. Our second category of line usage in the Wild Unknown Tarot is the static vertical lines. So there's not as many of these by a long shot as there are of the first category. In fact, there's quite few. I may have missed some when I was skimming through my deck, but I just pulled out 4 cards that have these solid static vertical lines going throughout the card. When I look at these static vertical lines, there's a feeling that the energy here is quite heavy. There's a sense that the energy is somewhat rigid. There's a more of a weight to the energy than we saw with the first category of cards. This isn't necessarily a negative thing, although we do certainly have the Nine of Swords and the Five of Swords, which are often considered to be some more difficult cards, and in the Wild Unknown in particular, they have more visceral imagery than a lot of the cards in the deck. But it's, again, this use of static vertical lines is not necessarily a negative thing, but it does somewhat indicate cards that can be more of a burdensome energy, and it can sometimes be even a bit of an oppressive energy, really. My favorite example of this is the Hierophant. I go into this in a lot of detail on my blog post about the meaning of this card, so you can check that out if you want to see it further. But when I look at particularly the imagery in the Wild Unknown Tarot, and I see the way the Hierophant is carrying this key, and then we have these heavy static vertical lines in the background, it gives me the impression that carrying this key can be a bit of a weight, and it can be a burden. It's a very heavy conviction to be carrying around. So again, that doesn't mean it's a negative thing. It just means it's, when you see these cards with these static vertical lines, think about how that energy is has more weight to it than maybe some of the static horizontal lines. On to our third category of line usage in the Wild Unknown Tarot, we now reach the center radiating lines. So by center radiating lines, what I mean is these are a group of cards in which there is a focal point somewhere in the background that serves as sort of the launching pad for emanating lines or radiating lines. There are more of these than we see with the static vertical lines, but there's not quite as many as the static horizontal lines. That's still kind of the bulk of the line usage in the card. With these center radiating lines, I think of these cards as ones in which the infinite untamed energy that we saw with the first category is now being directed consciously in most cases. My favorite example of this is the Magician, especially this being card 1, following card 0, the Fool, which we already talked about with the first category. This card really shows that notion that the energy that was kind of undirected and unmolded with the Fool, the Magician is now taking that energy and it's starting to be channeled into particular avenues. You'll notice when you look at this center radiating lines category that we have a lot of really proactive cards. We have the Chariot, we have the Father of Pentacles, the Son of Wands, so cards that are very much associated with directing consciously our energy to build things, to shape the world around us, to mold, to create. These cards also, I would say, show I want to say masculine, but I don't mean masculine in a male way, but more of we could say like a yang energy. So more of an outward facing, light energy. For example, the sun falls into this category as well. There's a lot of cards in this category that show kind of that emanating sense of joy and the radiating sense of personal power. One of the most interesting cards in this category, to me anyhow, is the Lovers, because on first inspection it doesn't seem to fit in exactly with some of the criteria that I just spoke about, but I really love the use of the center radiating lines in the Lovers card, because when I look at this card, particularly in the Wild Unknown Tarot, I think about co-creation. So I think about the infinite energies of the universe, which were unshapen, as we saw in the first category, and they're now being co-created. So they're still created through this universal force, but they're also being manifested and directed through humanity. Okay, we have reached the fourth and final category that I'm going to talk about with you today, and these are the cards that use multi-directional lines. There are actually quite a few of these in the deck, and it's one of the most interesting uses of lines in the Wild Unknown Tarot because it's a little harder to wrap your brain around, at least for me. When I talk about multi-directional lines, it's pretty straightforward, but here's a few examples. I'm talking about cards in which, as opposed to the entire background having a uniform usage of lines, there may be some lines that go vertical on half of the card. For example, with the Seven of Pentacles, we have half vertical lines and half horizontal lines, and then we have a few instances of cards where the lines kind of meet and seem to change directions in the center of the card or at multiple points within the card. When we see this use of multi-directional lines, it's a visual cue that this is a mixed, multifaceted energy. It's a little of this, a little of that. My favorite example of this is in the Justice card. We have a lot of visual cues that show that this is a multifaceted energy. We have the lines that change direction, and of course we have the black cat and the white cat, kind of reminiscent of the yin-yang symbol. Going back to the Seven of Pentacles as well, one of the key phrases that I sometimes associate with this card is assessment and direction change, and we can see that in the lines. They kind of meet in that center row of pentacles and then start going into a different direction. So these are cards that often show points where things can kind of merge, or things are sort of a balancing act. these cards, when you see these multi-directional lines, are a visual reminder that energies will fluctuate. They will overlap, they will change directions, they will be both good and bad at the same time, they will be both yin and yang at the same time, and so on. When I look at the multi-directional lines cards as well, one additional thing I wanted to point out that I find interesting is that we have both the Son of Cups as well as the Son of Swords that fit into this category. Now, most decks will call these cards the Knights. The Wild Unknown has adapted the term Sun. This use of lines in the Suns works really well for me because I sometimes associate the Knights or the Suns as being personalities or approaches to life that can quickly fluctuate and can sort of gravitate between both ends of an extreme. So, for example, with the Son of Swords, we can see a very articulate approach, a very measured approach, but in some instances that can quickly kind of reach that tipping point in the center of the card where it becomes biting, where it becomes harsh, where it becomes overly opinionated. That is it for now. If you have any thoughts on the use of lines in this deck, I would be very interested to hear those. I'm always kind of growing and forging my relationship with this deck, and I've already seen my perspectives change a lot as I've used the deck for readings and I've just gotten better acquainted with it. So I'm looking forward to going through some more interpretations with you guys of some of the different thoughts and feelings that I have about this deck. So once again, if you're interested in seeing my card by card breakdown, you can find all of those blog posts over at happyfishtarot.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.